There is a moment so quiet, so subtle that almost no one notices it when it happens. Empaths are often misunderstood because their endurance is mistaken for weakness. In reality, what looks like tolerance is a deep emotional skill rooted in awareness, regulation, and empathy, qualities Daniel Goleman often emphasizes as core emotional intelligence. An empath does not stay because they are unaware of harm. They stay because they are acutely aware of emotional complexity. They sense nuance. They recognize unspoken pain, unresolved trauma, and emotional patterns in others long before those patterns become visible on the surface. This endurance is not passive. It requires constant emotional labor. Empaths monitor not only their own inner states, but also the emotional climate around them. They adjust their responses, soften their words, delay their needs, and regulate their reactions in order to preserve connection. This level of self-regulation demands strength, not fragility. It is the ability to pause rather than react, to understand rather than accuse, and to remain grounded while emotions run high. What sustains this endurance is empathy, the capacity to feel with another person rather than merely for them. Empaths intuitively step into another's emotional world. They ask, often unconsciously, what might this person be carrying that explains their behavior? This perspective-taking allows them to forgive repeatedly, sometimes beyond what is reasonable. They believe that understanding can heal, that patience can transform, and that compassion can bridge emotional gaps. Yet this endurance comes at a cost. Emotional intelligence, when unbalanced, can turn inward and become self-sacrifice. Empaths may override their own emotional signals, fatigue, resentment, sadness, because they prioritize harmony and connection. They convince themselves that staying is kindness, that leaving would be abandonment, that setting limits would cause harm. Over time, this creates emotional depletion. The empath continues to give, but the internal reserves are quietly shrinking. Importantly, empaths are not unaware of this depletion. They feel it deeply, but they often delay acting on it because they can foresee the emotional consequences for others. This foresight, another element of emotional intelligence, keeps them engaged long after the relationship has become unbalanced. They are managing not just emotions but outcomes. This is why it is inaccurate to label empaths as weak. Weakness avoids discomfort, endurance absorbs it. Weakness reacts impulsively, endurance reflects and restrains. Empaths remain present in difficult emotional environments because they believe relationships can grow through understanding. They stay because they are strong enough to carry emotional weight until that weight becomes unsustainable. When an empath finally reaches a limit, it is not because they lacked strength. It is because they have used it for too long without reciprocity. Their endurance was real, intentional, and rooted in emotional intelligence. And when it ends only after everything within them has been given. Emotional withdrawal rarely announces itself, especially in those with high emotional intelligence. For an empath, detachment is not a dramatic rupture, but a gradual internal shift, shaped by self-awareness and long-term emotional regulation. Long before behavior changes on the surface, something subtle has already changed within. The empath begins to notice patterns, how effort flows in one direction, how conversations resolve nothing, how emotional needs remain unmet despite repeated attempts to communicate them clearly. This awareness does not trigger immediate action. Instead, it initiates reflection. Empaths examine their own reactions, questioning whether they are being too sensitive, too demanding, or too quick to feel hurt. This self-scrutiny is a hallmark of emotional intelligence. Rather than blaming others, they look inward first. They adjust, soften, explain differently, and try again. Each adjustment delays detachment, not because the empath is unaware of the imbalance, but because they are attempting to restore equilibrium without conflict. Over time, however, emotional regulation shifts from engagement to conservation. The empath begins to limit emotional output in small, almost invisible ways. They share less, react less intensely, and invest less anticipatory energy into interactions. This is not avoidance. It is an adaptive response to chronic emotional strain. The nervous system, having remained in a prolonged state of emotional attunement, starts to seek relief. Silence becomes a form of regulation rather than withdrawal. What makes this process difficult for others to recognize is its calmness. There is no argument to point to, no clear moment of rupture. The empath does not need an external event to justify detachment. The accumulation of unmet emotional needs is sufficient. From the outside, everything may appear unchanged. From the inside, the empath has already begun letting go of expectations. This quiet detachment reflects a shift in motivation, another core dimension of emotional intelligence. Early on, the empath's motivation is relational, to understand, to heal, to connect. As imbalance persists, motivation becomes protective. The goal is no longer to fix the relationship, but to preserve internal stability. Energy once spent on emotional labor is redirected inward, towards self-maintenance. Because this transition is internal, others often misinterpret it. They may perceive distance as indifference or passive aggression. In reality, it is acceptance. The empath has stopped resisting what is. They no longer argue with reality or invest emotional energy in outcomes they cannot control. This acceptance reduces reactivity, creating the impression of emotional distance. By the time detachment becomes visible, it is already complete. The empath did not leave suddenly. They arrived at silence slowly, thoughtfully, and with full emotional awareness. Detachment, in this sense, is not an act against another person. It is the natural consequence of sustained emotional imbalance and the final, quiet expression of self-regulation. Empaths possess an unusual sensitivity to emotional signals, allowing them to perceive not only what is expressed but also what remains unspoken. This heightened attunement is a central component of emotional intelligence, particularly in the domain of social awareness. They notice subtle shifts in tone, pauses in conversation, changes in energy, and emotional undercurrents that others may overlook. As a result, they often respond to needs that have never been clearly articulated, stepping in emotionally before they are asked. This capacity, while valuable, creates a tendency to take on emotional burdens that do not belong to them. When tension arises, empaths instinctively ask what they can do to ease it. They internalize responsibility for restoring balance, even when the source of distress lies outside their control. If someone is distant, irritable, or inconsistent, the empath assumes there must be pain underneath and feels compelled to absorb its impact rather than confront its origin. Over time, this pattern becomes habitual. Empaths regulate not only their own emotions, but also the emotional states of those around them. They anticipate reactions, soften truths, and carry conversations meant to prevent discomfort. This is emotional labor performed quietly and continuously. It requires attention, restraint, and empathy, but it often goes unnoticed because its success is measured by the absence of conflict rather than the presence of mutual care. The challenge arises when this emotional absorption replaces healthy boundaries. Emotional intelligence involves recognizing emotions accurately, but it also involves distinguishing between what is felt and what must be carried. Empaths, driven by compassion, may blur this distinction. They interpret another person's unresolved emotions as something they must manage. Guilt becomes a frequent companion, guilt for causing discomfort, for needing space, or for feeling overwhelmed by emotions they never created. This internalization can lead to chronic emotional fatigue. The empath may feel responsible for maintaining harmony while receiving little emotional reciprocity. They remain present, supportive, and understanding, even as their own emotional needs go unmet. Because they are skilled at self-regulation, they suppress signs of strain, convincing themselves that endurance is preferable to disruption. Crucially, this does not mean empaths lack awareness. They often know that the burden is uneven, but their empathy prioritizes others' emotional states over their own. They are guided by the belief that compassion requires sacrifice, that understanding another's pain justifies carrying it. This belief, while well-intentioned, creates imbalance. Daniel Goleman's framework emphasizes that emotional intelligence is not merely about empathy, but about balance. True emotional competence includes knowing when empathy must be paired with limits. When empaths absorb pain without boundaries, empathy turns into self-neglect. The cost is not immediate, but cumulative. Eventually, the emotional weight becomes unsustainable. What once felt like connection begins to feel like obligation. At that point, the empath system signals the need for change, not as a rejection of empathy, but as a recalibration of it. Letting go of emotional burdens that were never theirs becomes an act of emotional intelligence, restoring balance between understanding others and honoring the self. Silence is often misinterpreted, particularly in emotionally complex relationships. When an empath becomes quiet, observers may assume avoidance, punishment, or emotional manipulation. Yet within the framework of emotional intelligence, silence can serve a very different function. For an empath, withdrawing verbally or emotionally is often a regulatory response rather than a strategic one. It reflects a deliberate shift toward self-protection after sustained emotional strain. Empaths typically communicate early and often. They explain their feelings, clarify intentions, and attempt to resolve misunderstandings through dialogue. This openness is driven by empathy and social awareness, the belief that understanding leads to repair. When silence appears, it is not the first response, but the final one. It emerges only after repeated communication has failed to produce change or mutual understanding. At this stage, silence functions as a boundary. Emotional intelligence involves recognizing not only emotions but also limits. An empath eventually becomes aware that continued explanation is depleting rather than constructive. The nervous system, having remained in a heightened state of emotional attunement, begins to require rest. Silence reduces stimulation, minimizes reactivity, and creates psychological space. It is a way of restoring equilibrium when engagement no longer feels safe or productive. This form of silence is not passive aggression. Manipulation seeks control over another person's behavior or emotions. The empath's silence seeks neither control nor reaction. In fact, it relinquishes both. By stepping back, the empath releases the expectation that others will change, understand, or respond differently. This acceptance is a hallmark of emotional maturity. The empath is no longer investing energy in outcomes beyond their influence. Goleman's model highlights self-regulation as a core emotional skill. Silence in this context is self-regulation in action. It prevents escalation, protects against emotional flooding, and allows the individual to maintain internal stability. Rather than expressing frustration impulsively or continuing to engage in draining interactions, the empath chooses restraint. This choice is intentional, even if it is quiet. For those accustomed to the empath's emotional availability, this boundary can feel abrupt or confusing. The absence of emotional responsiveness may be interpreted as indifference. In reality, it reflects discernment. The empath has learned to differentiate between empathy and self-sacrifice. Silence becomes the point at which compassion for others is balanced with responsibility to the self. Importantly, this boundary is not meant to teach a lesson or provoke regret. It is not conditional or temporary. It is a recalibration of emotional investment. The empath remains aware, sensitive, and perceptive, but no longer accessible in the same way. In this sense, silence is not emptiness, it is clarity. It signals the end of emotional overextension and the beginning of self-respect. Far from being manipulative, it is the empath's most honest response to prolonged imbalance, a quiet declaration that emotional health requires limits, even when empathy remains intact. Detachment in an empath is rarely impulsive. It is the outcome of a long internal process shaped by reflection, emotional monitoring, and repeated attempts at repair. Within the framework of emotional intelligence, this process reflects advanced self-awareness and deliberate choice rather than emotional reactivity. By the time an empath detaches, the decision has already been tested internally many times. Empaths do not withdraw at the first sign of discomfort. Instead, they observe patterns over time. They notice whether effort is reciprocated, whether conversations lead to change, and whether emotional needs are acknowledged or consistently minimized. This pattern recognition is a cognitive component of emotional intelligence. It allows the empath to move beyond isolated incidents and assess the emotional health of the relationship as a whole. Before detaching, empaths typically communicate their concerns clearly, often more than once. They articulate feelings with care, choosing words that minimize blame and emphasize understanding. They attempt to explain the impact of behaviors rather than assign fault. Each conversation represents another opportunity for mutual awareness. Each unmet response adds to the internal record the empath is quietly keeping. As these attempts accumulate without meaningful change, the empath's internal dialogue begins to shift. Hope gives way to realism. The question moves from "how can this be fixed?" to "what is this costing me?" This shift is subtle but significant. It marks the transition from externally focused empathy to internally focused self-awareness. Emotional intelligence at its core involves recognizing when persistence becomes self-neglect. Detachment then becomes a conscious act of regulation. Rather than reacting in anger or resentment, the empath chooses disengagement. This choice reflects emotional restraint and foresight. The empath understands that continuing to invest emotionally will only deepen exhaustion and resentment. Detachment is chosen not to punish the other person, but to prevent further internal harm. What distinguishes this decision from impulsive withdrawal is its finality. Empaths do not detach lightly because they understand the emotional consequences for all involved. Once they accept that the pattern is unlikely to change, they also accept that re-engagement would reopen the same wounds. This clarity makes detachment feel irreversible. The decision is grounded not in emotion alone, but in accumulated evidence and self-reflection. Goleman emphasizes that emotional intelligence includes the ability to manage long-term emotional outcomes, not just immediate feelings. The empath's detachment reflects this capacity. It prioritizes future emotional stability over short-term relief or reconciliation. It is a strategic, self-respecting response to sustained imbalance. By the time detachment is visible, the decision has already been made internally. The empath has grieved the loss of what they hoped the relationship could become. What remains is not bitterness, but resolve. Detachment stands as the final boundary, carefully considered, emotionally informed, and chosen only when all other options have been exhausted. When an empath finally steps away, the choice is often misunderstood as a loss of care. In reality, it reflects a reordering of priorities shaped by emotional intelligence. Empaths do not stop caring about others. They begin caring about themselves with the same seriousness they once reserved for everyone else. This shift is not abrupt or selfish. It is the result of prolonged emotional imbalance and a growing awareness that self-neglect is incompatible with emotional health. Throughout the relationship, the empath's attention has been directed outward. They have monitored moods, adjusted responses, and absorbed emotional strain in order to maintain connection. Over time, this outward focus can eclipse awareness of personal needs. Emotional intelligence, however, involves recognizing internal signals as clearly as external ones. Eventually, the empath begins to listen to fatigue, numbness, and emotional depletion not as temporary states but as meaningful data. This listening initiates a reassessment of responsibility. Empaths realize that compassion does not require unlimited access to their emotional resources. Goleman's framework emphasizes balance between empathy and self-regulation, between social awareness and self-awareness. Choosing self-respect is an act of alignment within this balance. It means acknowledging that care offered without reciprocity becomes unsustainable. As self-respect grows, attachment loosens. The empath stops deriving identity from being needed or emotionally available. This does not diminish their empathy, it refines it. They no longer equate closeness with endurance or loyalty with self-sacrifice. Instead, they begin to value mutuality, emotional safety, and respect as prerequisites for connection. This recalibration explains why empaths rarely return once they have detached. The decision to leave is informed by deep emotional processing. They have already examined the relationship from multiple perspectives, weighed potential outcomes, and accepted the emotional cost of departure. Returning would require denying the insights that led to self-respect in the first place. Emotional intelligence favors coherence over contradiction. Once a truth is integrated, it is difficult to unsee. Importantly, the empath's departure is not fueled by resentment. They may still understand the other person's limitations and struggles. Empathy remains intact. What has changed is access. The empath no longer offers emotional proximity where it undermines their well-being. This distinction between understanding and availability is a mature expression of emotional intelligence. Choosing oneself does not erase care for others, it establishes boundaries around it. The empath learns that compassion without limits erodes the very capacity to care. By prioritizing self-respect, they preserve emotional health and integrity. In this light, detachment is not an ending defined by loss, but a transition defined by growth. The empath does not walk away hardened or indifferent. They walk away clearer, more grounded, and aligned with their emotional truth. Once this alignment is achieved, returning to self-neglect is no longer an option.